20 pieces of silver, cold metal pressing against calloused palms. In the scorching heat of an ancient caravan route, a transaction takes place that will echo through millennia. A brother's fate sealed not by hatred but by calculation, not by passion but by profit. The man who orchestrates this betrayal carries a name that means praise: Judah. Yet on this day there is nothing praiseworthy in his actions, only the bitter taste of silver and the sound of chains binding flesh and blood. But this is not just a story of betrayal. This is the story of a man whose name would become synonymous with an entire people, a lineage that would birth kings and prophets, a bloodline that would carry the weight of divine promise through centuries of triumph and exile. How does a man who sells his own brother become the father of a royal dynasty? How does betrayal transform into blessing? How does darkness give birth to light? The answers lie buried beneath layers of ancient sand and modern assumptions, hidden in the shadows of a story we thought we knew. Tonight you will discover the dark truth about Judah, a truth that will shatter everything you believed about heroes and villains, about redemption and condemnation, about the price of transformation. The silver has already changed hands. The deed is done. But the story has only just begun. The tents of Jacob stretched across the wilderness like scattered stars against an endless canvas of dust and stone. Here, in this nomadic kingdom built on promises and dreams, a family dynasty was taking root. But the soil was poisoned from the very beginning. Leah's hands trembled as she cradled her fourth son against her chest. The child's cries echoed across the camp, a sound both joyful and bitter. Another son, another chance for her husband's love, another disappointment waiting to unfold. Jacob's eyes barely lingered on the infant before turning away, searching the horizon for something more captivating than this moment of birth. His heart resided in another tent, another woman with children yet to come who would carry his deepest affections. The name came to Leah like a whisper from heaven itself: Judah. This time I will praise the Lord. The Hebrew word rolled off her tongue like a prayer and a prophecy combined. She could not have known that this child, born from longing and named in hope, would one day embody the very opposite of praise. The ancient world was not kind to unloved wives or their children. In the harsh mathematics of desert survival, affection meant resources, protection, inheritance. Leah's sons grew up watching their father's face light up when Rachel entered a room, witnessing the subtle favoritism that divided their household into camps of the cherished and the endured. Young Judah learned early that love was a finite resource, carefully rationed and strategically distributed. He watched his mother's desperate attempts to win Jacob's heart through childbearing, each new son a silent plea for recognition that went largely unanswered. The psychological landscape of his childhood was mapped by rejection and populated by the ghosts of unmet expectations. The boy who would become the patriarch of kings grew up in the shadow of his mother's humiliation. Every meal served in silence. Every night when Jacob chose another tent. Every morning when their father's attention turned first to other children taught Judah a fundamental lesson about the world. Power belonged to those who were loved, and love was earned through cunning, not birthright. In this environment, empathy became a luxury the unloved could not afford. Judah's heart hardened like clay left too long in the desert sun, protective and impermeable. He learned to calculate relationships like trade agreements, measuring what could be gained against what must be sacrificed. The family dynamics that shaped Judah's character were more complex than simple favoritism. Jacob himself carried the wounds of deception, having tricked his own brother out of a birthright and fled from the consequences. The patterns of manipulation and betrayal that would later define Judah's choices were already woven into the fabric of their family history. As Judah grew from infant to child to young man, he absorbed these lessons with the efficiency of one whose survival depended on understanding the unspoken rules. He watched his older brothers Reuben, Simeon, and Levi struggle with their own responses to their father's indifference. Reuben, the firstborn, sought attention through reckless acts of passion. Simeon and Levi channeled their anger into violence that would eventually earn them their father's curse. But Judah chose a different path. He became a student of human nature, learning to read the subtle signs that revealed a person's desires and weaknesses. Where his brothers raged against their circumstances, Judah adapted to them. Where they demanded recognition, he learned to seize opportunities. The desert taught harsh lessons about resource management. Water was precious, food was scarce, and survival often required difficult choices. In this environment, Judah developed what would later be recognized as both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness: the ability to make calculated decisions without being hindered by emotional attachment. When the rains failed and the wells ran dry, it was Judah who suggested which animals to slaughter first. When disputes arose over grazing rights, it was Judah who negotiated the compromises that kept the family moving forward. His brothers began to look to him for practical solutions, even as they remained wary of the cold calculation behind his helpful suggestions. The irony was not lost on those who knew the family well. The child named for praise had become the one least likely to inspire it. Yet his effectiveness could not be denied. While his brothers stumbled through emotional reactions to their father's favoritism, Judah learned to navigate the complex currents of family politics with an almost supernatural skill. The servants whispered about the fourth son, noting how he seemed to understand things that others missed. They watched him observe conversations from the shadows, filing away information that might prove useful later. Some called it wisdom beyond his years. Others recognized it as something darker. As Judah entered adolescence, the family dynamics grew even more complicated. Rachel finally bore Jacob a son, and the camp erupted in celebrations that had never accompanied the births of Leah's children. Joseph arrived like a small god into their midst, instantly claiming the devotion that Judah and his brothers had spent years trying to earn. The contrast was devastating in its clarity. Where Judah had learned to work for every scrap of attention, Joseph basked in unconditional love. Where Judah had developed cunning to compensate for his disadvantage, Joseph could afford the luxury of innocence. Where Judah had been forced to mature quickly in the harsh reality of a divided household, Joseph remained protected by his father's doting affection. The psychological wounds inflicted by this disparity ran deeper than simple jealousy. Judah watched his father lavish on Joseph the kind of paternal pride that he himself had never experienced. Every gift, every gentle word, every protective gesture toward the favored son was a reminder of what Judah had been denied. Yet even as bitterness took root in his heart, Judah's calculating mind was already working. He observed how Joseph's privileged position made him vulnerable, how his innocence left him unprepared for the harsh realities that Judah had been forced to master. Seeds of a plan began to form, though even Judah could not have predicted where those seeds would eventually lead. The stage was being set for a tragedy that would define not just one family but the destiny of nations. In the tents of Jacob under the vast desert sky, the man who would sell his own bloodline was learning the lessons that would make such betrayal not just possible but inevitable. The child named for praise was becoming someone capable else entirely, someone that of acts would echo through history like the sound of silver coins falling onto stone. The morning sun cast long shadows across the camp when 17-year-old Joseph emerged from his father's tent, wrapped in the coat of many colors that had become both symbol and curse. The garment caught the light like captured rainbows, each thread a reminder of favoritism that cut deeper than any blade. Judah watched from beside the cooking fire, his hands steady as he tended the flames, his face revealing nothing of the storm brewing within. At 22, he had mastered the art of concealment, learned to hide his emotions behind a mask of practical competence. But masks, no matter how carefully crafted, cannot contain the pressure building beneath forever. The coat was an insult wrapped in silk and gold thread, not just to Judah but to all of Leah's sons who had spent their lives earning nothing more than their father's distracted acknowledgement. Joseph wore their father's love like a garment, visible and enviable, while they remained clothed in the rough wool of indifference. But it was not the coat alone that finally broke something fundamental in Judah's carefully controlled world. It was the dreams. Joseph's voice carried across the camp with the thoughtless confidence of one who had never learned to fear rejection. He spoke of sheaves bowing down, of stars and moon prostrating themselves before him. Each word fell like stones into the still pool of family resentment, sending ripples of anger outward in ever-widening circles. Judah's brothers reacted with the raw fury of men who had been pushed beyond endurance. Simeon's hands clenched into fists. Levi's jaw tightened with murderous intent. Even gentle Reuben's face darkened with something approaching violence. But Judah felt something different, something colder and more dangerous than anger. He felt the crystalline clarity of a man who had just seen his future mapped out in the stars of his brother's arrogant dreams. Joseph would rise. Jacob would ensure it. The birthright that should have belonged to Reuben, the leadership that might have fallen to any of them, would instead be handed to this pampered child who had never known a day of real struggle, unless something changed. The transformation in Judah was not sudden but gradual, like water slowly freezing into ice. The last remnants of brotherly affection, already worn thin by years of neglect and favoritism, finally crystallized into something harder and more purposeful. Love became calculation. Hope became strategy. In the days that followed, Judah watched his brother's rage burn bright and hot. consuming them with plans for violence that would ultimately destroy them all. Simeon spoke of blood. Levi sharpened his blade. Even Reuben, despite his attempts at moderation, could not disguise the murder in his eyes. But Judah saw further than his brother's immediate fury. He understood that killing Joseph would solve nothing and create countless new problems. Their father's grief would be unbearable. The questions would be endless. The guilt would poison whatever remained of their family bonds. There had to be another way. A solution that would remove the threat Joseph represented while preserving the illusion of innocence that Judah's brothers would need to live with themselves afterward. The answer came to him during the long night watches, when he sat alone under stars that seemed to mock Joseph's grandiose dreams. If Joseph disappeared without a trace, if his body was never found, Jacob's grief would be complete but finite. The family could mourn and move forward. The natural order of inheritance could be restored. But if Joseph simply vanished, there would be no profit in it. No compensation for the years of humiliation and neglect that Judah and his brothers had endured. The solution, when it finally crystallized in Judah's mind, was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its coldness. Joseph would not die by their hands, but he would cease to exist as far as their family was concerned. He would become someone else's problem, someone else's slave. And in the process, his brothers would gain not just their freedom from his presence, but actual silver as compensation for their loss. 20 pieces of silver, the going rate for a young, healthy slave in the ancient world. Not enough to make them wealthy, but sufficient to feel that some cosmic justice had been served. Joseph's dreams of dominion would become the reality of bondage, while his brothers would profit from the very arrogance that had tormented them for so long. The plan required careful timing and perfect execution. More importantly, it required Judah to convince his brothers that his solution was superior to their more violent intentions. He would need to present the idea not as calculated cruelty, but as practical mercy. As Judah refined his strategy, he found himself studying Joseph with new eyes. No longer seeing a brother, however despised, but evaluating him as one might assess livestock at market. Strong back, good teeth, unmarked skin that would appeal to potential buyers. The boy who had tormented them with dreams of superiority would fetch a fair price in the slave markets of Egypt. The psychological distance Judah created between himself and Joseph was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his transformation. He did not allow himself to imagine Joseph's fears or pain. He did not consider the life of labor and degradation that awaited his brother in a foreign land. Such thoughts would only interfere with the clear thinking required to execute his plan. Instead, Judah focused on the practical benefits his solution would provide. Their father's favorite would be gone, removing the constant reminder of their own inadequacy. The natural order of inheritance would be restored, giving each brother a fair chance at their father's blessing. And they would all profit financially from a situation that had previously offered them nothing but pain. It was, in Judah's calculating mind, the perfect solution. Joseph would live, sparing them the guilt of fratricide. Jacob would never learn the truth, preserving their relationship with their father. And justice would be served, as the brother who had lorded his superiority over them learned what it meant to be powerless. The only thing Judah did not calculate was the cost to his own soul. As the day of reckoning approached, as Jacob prepared to send Joseph to check on his brothers in the distant pastures, Judah felt no excitement, no anticipation of revenge finally served. Instead, he felt the cold satisfaction of a problem about to be solved efficiently and profitably. The man who had been named for praise was about to commit an act that would echo through history as one of the greatest betrayals ever recorded. But in his own mind, he was simply being practical. After all, what was one brother's freedom compared to the liberation of 10? The sun hung merciless and white in the cloudless sky when the brothers spotted Joseph's familiar silhouette against the horizon. The coat of many colors blazed like a banner of arrogance across the barren landscape, each thread catching light as if the heavens themselves conspired to announce the arrival of Jacob's beloved son. Judah felt his pulse quicken, not with brotherly affection but with the cold anticipation of a hunter who has finally cornered his prey. The moment he had carefully orchestrated was arriving with the inevitability of dawn breaking over the desert. Joseph approached their camp with the careless confidence of one who had never learned to read danger in his brothers' faces. His voice carried across the distance, bright with youthful enthusiasm, calling out greetings that fell into the silence like stones dropped into a deep well. The brothers exchanged glances heavy with unspoken understanding. Simeon's hand moved instinctively toward his blade. Levi's jaw tightened with barely contained fury. Even Reuben, despite his natural inclination toward mercy, could not disguise the darkness that had settled over his features. But it was Judah who stepped forward first, his voice steady and reasonable, cutting through the tension like a shepherd's staff guiding wayward sheep. "Brothers," he said, his tone carrying the weight of careful consideration, "let us not be hasty in our anger." Joseph reached the edge of their camp, his smile beginning to falter as he read the expressions surrounding him. The coat that had seemed so magnificent from a distance now appeared garish and offensive up close, a silk-wrapped insult to every man who had ever earned his bread through honest labor. "I word from our father," Joseph began, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. But his words were cut short as rough hands seized him, Simeon and Levi moving with the swift efficiency of men who had made their decision long before this moment arrived. The coat was torn from Joseph's shoulders with deliberate violence, the precious fabric ripping along seams that had been crafted with such care. The sound of tearing silk seemed to echo across the empty wilderness, a death knell for the favoritism it represented. "Swamamamut." They bound him with the same ropes they used to secure their flocks, Joseph's protests growing weaker as the reality of his situation began to penetrate his shock. The pit they chose was deep enough to hold him but shallow enough to preserve the merchandise. Judah had selected it carefully during his earlier reconnaissance of the area. As his brothers argued about what to do next, their voices rising with bloodlust and righteous fury, Judah remained silent. He watched the horizon with the patience of a merchant waiting for the right moment to close a deal. The timing had to be perfect. The dust cloud appeared first, a distant smudge against the blue sky that gradually resolved into the familiar sight of a trading caravan. Ishmaelites, by the look of their banners, returning from Egypt with empty wagons and full purses, ready to purchase whatever goods might present themselves along the ancient trade routes. Judah's heart beat with calculated precision as he counted the camels, estimated the wealth of the merchant leader, assessed the likelihood of a profitable negotiation. Everything was falling into place exactly as he had envisioned. "Hey, brothers," he called out, his voice cutting through their heated debate about Joseph's fate. "What profit is there if we kill our brother and hide his blood? Come, let us sell him to these Ishmaelites. Let our hands not be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." The words came out smooth, as reasonable honey as morning rain. Judah presented the idea not as betrayal but as mercy, not as cruelty but as wisdom. His brothers, caught up in their rage and desperate for any solution that would remove Joseph from their lives, seized upon his suggestion with the relief of drowning men grasping a rope. The negotiation was swift and businesslike. The Ishmaelite merchant examined Joseph with the dispassionate eye of a man accustomed to evaluating human cargo. He noted the boy's youth, his unmarked skin, the strength in his limbs that promised years of profitable labor. 20 pieces of silver changed hands with the casual efficiency of any commercial transaction. The metal was warm from the merchant's purse, and Judah felt its weight in his palm like a physical manifestation of justice finally served. Each coin represented a year of humiliation repaid, a slight avenged, a balance restore's eyes found. Joseph Judah's across the small crowd of merchants and brothers, and in that moment something passed between them that neither would ever forget. Not hatred, which might have been easier to bear, but a profound bewilderment. The look of someone trying to comprehend how the world could shift so completely in the span of a heartbeat. The chains that bound Joseph's wrists were crafted by skilled metal workers, designed to hold without causing damage that might reduce his market value. As they led him toward the caravan, his feet stumbled slightly on the uneven ground, and Judah felt a momentary flicker of something that might once have been compassion, but the feeling passed as quickly as it had come, replaced by the cold satisfaction of a problem efficiently solved. Joseph's dreams of dominion were becoming the reality of bondage, and the natural order of things was being restored through the simple mechanism of supply and demand. The caravan disappeared into the shimmering distance, taking with it the brother who had tormented them with visions of his own superiority. The silver was divided the same casual precision among the brothers with that had governed the sale itself. Each man's share carefully weighed and counted. As the dust settled and the camp returned to its normal rhythm, Judah found himself holding his portion of the silver up to catch the afternoon light. The metal gleamed with a beauty almost that seemed divine, as if heaven itself had blessed their transaction. The coat of many colors lay forgotten in the dust, its brilliant threads already beginning to fade under the desert sun. Soon it would be nothing but a memory like the brother who had once worn it with such pride. But even as Judah pocketed his silver and turned his attention to more practical matters, Something deep within him recognized that this moment would echo through time in ways he could not yet imagine. The decision made in the heat and dust of an ordinary afternoon would ripple forward through generations, shaping destinies and defining the character of nations. The man who had sold his own bloodline told himself it was business, nothing more. Just a simple transaction between practical men who understood the value of silver and the cost of dreams. Yet somewhere in the vast silence of the desert, the sound of chains and the weight of coins were already beginning their long journey toward a reckoning that would transform betrayal into something neither anticipate, Judah nor his brothers could have ever. The blood was not Joseph's, but it might as well have been. They slaughtered a young goat at sunset, its life ending with the swift efficiency of men who had long ago learned to kill without sentiment. The crimson that stained the coat of many colors was warm and thick, pooling in the precious fabric's intricate patterns like guilt made visible. Judah's hands worked methodically, ensuring the deception would be complete. Every thread had to tell the story they needed Jacob to believe. Every stain had to speak of tragedy rather than treachery. The artistry required for such elaborate lies demanded a steadiness that surprised even him. As night fell over their camp, the brothers gathered around the bloodied garment like mourners at a grave. But there was no grief in their circle, only the hollow satisfaction of men who had convinced themselves that justice had been served. The coat that had once blazed with color now lay darkened with false blood, its beauty transformed into evidence of a fabricated tragedy. Reuben arrived at dawn to find the pit empty, his face cycling through confusion, relief, and finally settling into the grim acceptance of complicity. He had not been present for the sale, but the silver in his brother's pouches told the story more clearly than words ever could. The journey home stretched before them like a path through purgatory. Each step carried them further from the scene of their crime and closer to the moment when they would have to look into their father's eyes and speak the lie that would shatter his heart. Judah found himself studying his brothers' faces during the long march, noting how each man processed what they had done. Simeon and Levi wore their guilt like armor, transformed into something hard and defensive. The younger brothers moved with the nervous energy of accomplices who had not fully understood the magnitude of their actions until it was too late to retreat. But it was the weight of the silver that haunted Judah most. The coins in his pouch seemed to grow heavier with each passing mile, their metallic whisper a constant reminder of the price they had placed on their brother's freedom. He had calculated the transaction in terms of justice and profit, but he had not anticipated the psychological toll of carrying blood money. The nights were the worst. When the camp settled into sleep and the desert fell silent, Judah would lie awake listening to the wind carry sounds that might have been Joseph's voice calling out across impossible distances. His practical mind dismissed such thoughts as imagination born of exhaustion, but his dreams told a different story. In those dreams, the silver burned his hands like molten metal. The coins multiplied endlessly, spilling from his pouch in an avalanche of guilt that threatened to bury him alive. He would wake with his heart pounding and his palms slick with sweat, the taste of copper thick on his tongue. As they drew closer to home, The weight of their deception began to manifest in physical symptoms. Judah's appetite disappeared, leaving him hollow and sharp-edged. His temper, usually so carefully controlled, began to fray at unexpected moments. The man who had orchestrated the perfect crime was discovering that perfection came with a price he had not anticipated. The other brothers looked to him for leadership in their guilt, but Judah found himself increasingly isolated by the very success of his plan. They had all participated in the betrayal, but it was his voice that had spoken the words that sealed Joseph's fate, his calculation that had transformed murder into merchandise, his silver that clinked with every step they took toward home. When they finally crested the hill that overlooked their father's camp, Judah felt something inside him break. The familiar sight of the tent spread across the valley. The smoke rising from cooking fires, the normal rhythm of life continuing in blissful ignorance of the tragedy about to unfold. It all seemed suddenly precious and fragile. Jacob emerged from his tent as they approached, his face bright with the expectation of news from his beloved son. The old man's eyes searched their group automatically, looking for the splash of color that should have announced Joseph's presence. When he failed to find it, confusion clouded his features like shadows racing across the sun. The presentation of the bloodied coat was a masterpiece of theatrical deception. They laid it before their father with the solemn gravity of men bearing tragic news, their faces carefully composed into masks of grief and shock. The fabric spread across the ground like a fallen sunset, its beauty transformed into evidence of loss. Jacob's reaction exceeded even their most pessimistic expectations. The old man's legs gave way beneath him as he recognized the garment, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the blood-stained fabric. The sound that escaped his throat was not quite human. Part scream, part sob, part prayer to a God who seemed suddenly absent from the world. "It is my son's coat," Jacob whispered, his voice breaking like pottery dropped on stone. "A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." The old man's grief was so complete, so overwhelming in its raw authenticity, that even the brothers who had orchestrated the deception found themselves shaken by its intensity. This was not the measured sorrow they had anticipated, but something primal and devastating that seemed to crack the very foundations of their world. Jacob tore his own garments with the violence of a man trying to tear away his own skin. He scattered dust over his head and fell to the ground, his body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the deepest wells of human anguish. The sight of their father's complete breakdown was more terrible than any of them had imagined. As the days passed and Jacob's grief showed no signs of abating, the brothers found themselves trapped in the prison of their own deception. They had expected their father to mourn and then gradually recover, allowing the family to move forward with a new dynamic. Instead, they watched him waste away before their eyes, consumed by a sorrow that seemed to be killing him slowly. The silver that had once felt like justice now felt like poison in their purses. Judah found himself unable to spend even the smallest coin, as if the metal itself was contaminated by the lie it represented. The practical profit he had envisioned from their transaction transformed into a psychological burden that grew heavier with each passing day. Worse still was the realization that their plan had worked too well. Joseph was gone, But his absence had not restored the natural order they had hoped for. Instead, it had created a vacuum filled only by their father's inconsolable grief and their own crushing guilt. The irony was bitter and complete. In trying to free themselves from Joseph's dominance, they had made him more present in their lives than ever before. His ghost haunted every meal, every conversation, every moment when Jacob's eyes would search the horizon hopefully before remembering that his beloved son would never return. Judah began to understand that some transactions cannot be completed with silver alone. Some prices demand payment in portions of the soul, and the interest on such debts compounds with each passing day until it threatens to consume everything the debtor holds dear. The man who had calculated so carefully, who had planned so methodically, was learning that the human heart operates by mathematics too complex for any earthly wisdom to solve. Distance became Judah's refuge, with Joseph's ghost haunting every corner of his father's camp, and Jacob's grief a constant accusation hanging in the air. Judah made a decision that would reshape his destiny as surely as selling his brother had defined his past. He would leave. Not in exile, but in search of something he could not name. Perhaps absolution, perhaps simply the space to breathe without tasting guilt with every breath. The road to Adullam stretched before him like a path toward forgetfulness. His friend Hira walked beside him, their conversation light and meaningless, carefully avoiding the shadows that seemed to follow Judah like faithful dogs. In this new place, among people who knew nothing of silver and brothers and blood-stained coats, perhaps he could become someone different. But geography cannot cure what lives in the soul. The Canaanite woman he met in Adullam was everything his family's traditions warned against. Beautiful where Hebrew wives were expected to be modest, worldly where they were meant to be sheltered, sophisticated in ways that spoke of cultures his people had been commanded to avoid. Her name was Shua, and she represented everything Judah was not supposed to want. Perhaps that was exactly why he wanted her. Their courtship was swift and passionate, conducted in the language of desperate men seeking to outrun their past. Judah threw himself into this new identity with the same calculating intensity he had once applied to family politics. He would become a husband, a father, a man with roots in foreign soil and no troublesome memories to disturb his peace. The wedding was a Canaanite affair, rich with rituals and customs that would have horrified his father. Judah participated with an enthusiasm that surprised even him. As if by embracing these foreign ways completely, he could somehow shed his Hebrew skin entirely. The silver he had earned from Joseph's sale paid for the celebration, its curse transformed temporarily into blessing. Shua bore him 3 sons in quick succession, Onan, and Shelah. Each birth felt like another step away from the brother he had sold and the father he had deceived. These children would know nothing of Hebrew guilt and tribal obligations. They would be free the burdens that had shaped from their father's tortured conscience. But children, like silver, carry more than their surface value. Grew into a young man whose beauty was matched only by his cruelty. There was something cold behind his eyes that reminded Judah uncomfortably of himself in darker moments. The boy took pleasure in power over others, delighting in the kind of calculated malice that required both intelligence and an absence of empathy. Onan possessed his brother's cunning but lacked his restraint. Where Er was coldly strategic in his wickedness, Onan was impulsive and crude. He took what he wanted without consideration for consequence, living as if the world owed him whatever he desired simply by virtue of his existence. Even young Shelah showed signs of the moral corruption that seemed to run through their bloodline like poisoned water. The child was selfish and manipulative, learning how early to play his parents each other to against get his way. Judah watched his sons grow with a growing ease. He sensed of Yun's complications his family had flew only to create new ones in foreign soil. The patterns of deception and betrayal that had defined his youth were manifesting in his children with a clarity that was both fascinating and terrifying. When Er came of age, Judah arranged his marriage to a young woman named Tamar. She was beautiful and intelligent, with eyes that seemed to see more than was comfortable for those who preferred their secrets hidden. There was something about her that reminded Judah of the Hebrew women of his youth, a strength wrapped in silk that spoke of deeper currents beneath the surface. The marriage was a disaster from its beginning. Er treated his new wife with a casual cruelty that went beyond mere indifference. He seemed to take pleasure in her discomfort, in the way she tried to hide her fear behind dutiful smiles. The young man who had learned manipulation at his father's knee applied those lessons to his marriage with a thoroughness that was both impressive and horrifying. The end came suddenly, and with a finality that left no room for argument. Simply died, his body found in his bed one morning with no wound, no poison, no explanation beyond the fact that his heart had simply stopped beating. The servants whispered of divine judgment, but Judah dismissed such talk as superstition. Still, the timing was unsettling. Custom demanded that Onan take his brother's widow as wife, fulfilling the levirate obligation that would preserve Er's lineage through any children the union might produce. It was an ancient law, older than memory, designed to protect widows and maintain family continuity. Onan accepted the arrangement with apparent enthusiasm, but his compliance was as false as everything else about Judah's carefully constructed new life. The young man had no intention of providing children who would claim inheritance meant for his own offspring. His solution was as creative as it was cruel. He would lie with Tamar dutifully, maintaining the appearance of fulfilling his obligation while ensuring that no child would result from their union. It was a deception worthy of his father, calculated and thorough in its selfishness. The arrangement continued for months, with Tamar growing increasingly desperate as her womb remained empty. She began to suspect the truth, but had no power to confront it directly. In a world where women's value was measured primarily through their ability to produce sons, Onan was systematically destroying her future while maintaining plausible deniability. Then Onan died suddenly as his brother had, his life ending with the same inexplicable finality. This time even Judah could not dismiss the servants' whispers about divine retribution. Two sons, both wicked, both dead in their prime, with no natural explanation for their passing. The pattern was too clear to ignore, too pointed to explain away as coincidence. Fear crept into Judah's heart like cold water seeping through stone. If God was indeed striking down his sons for their wickedness, What did that say about the father who had raised them? What judgment awaited the man whose own sins had poisoned his bloodline so thoroughly that divine intervention was required to stop its spread? Tamar remained in his household, a living reminder of his family's failures. Tradition demanded that she be given to Shelah when he came of age, but Judah found himself reluctant to risk his remaining son to whatever curse seemed to follow his daughter-in-law. Instead, he sent her back to her father's house with vague promises about the future. It was another calculated decision, another attempt to manage consequences through careful planning. But Judah was beginning to understand that some forces operate beyond the reach of human calculation. The silver from Joseph's sale had long since been spent, transformed into wedding feasts and funeral expenses and the daily costs of maintaining a lie. But the guilt remained, accumulating interest like a debt that could never be fully paid. In the quiet moments between one crisis and the next, Judah found his thoughts returning obsessively to that distant afternoon when 20 pieces of silver had changed hands. He wondered where Joseph was now, whether he still lived, whether he ever thought of the brothers who had sold him like livestock. The questions multiplied in the darkness, each one spawning others until Judah's nights became populated by an army of uncertainties that marched through his dreams with the persistence of unpaid debts. The man who had once believed he could solve any problem through careful planning was discovering that some problems grow larger the more attention they receive, spreading through a life like cracks through poorly fired pottery until everything threatens to shatter at the slightest touch. The marketplace in Timnah buzzed with the familiar rhythms of commerce and gossip, sheep bleating, merchants haggling, children weaving between the stalls like quick-fingered thieves seeking opportunity. It was shearing season, and the air carried the scent of wool and sweat and the promise of profit. Judah walked through the crowd with the measured pace of a man who had learned to carry his secrets carefully. The years since his sons' deaths had carved new lines around his eyes, deepening the shadows that seemed to follow him wherever he went. At 43, he was still strong, still capable, but something fundamental had shifted in his bearing. The guilt over Joseph had never left him, but it had evolved. Like wine left too long in the sun, it had fermented into something darker and more complex. Some days it tasted of regret. Other days of a bitter justification that insisted he had done what was necessary for his family's survival. His friend Hira walked beside him, their conversation light and meaningless, carefully avoiding the subjects that had come to define Judah's existence. Death, divine judgment, the weight of silver that had never quite stopped clinking in his memory. The news of his wife Shua's death had reached them that morning, carried by a servant whose face bore the careful neutrality of one accustomed to delivering unwelcome information. The fever had taken her quickly, they said, as if speed could somehow soften the blow of loss. Judah felt the grief like a distant storm, its thunder muffled by the layers of emotional protection he had built around his heart. Shua had been his escape from Hebrew guilt and tribal obligations. Now that escape was closing behind him like a door swinging shut in a strong wind. The period of mourning was prescribed by custom, measured in days and rituals that would mark the boundary between married man and widower. But Judah found himself chafing against the restrictions, eager for the freedom that would come when he could once again move through the world without the weight of others' expectations. It was during this restless waiting that he noticed the woman by the roadside. She sat veiled at the entrance to Enaim, positioned where the path divided toward Timnah. Her clothing marked her as a prostitute, available for the kind of transaction that required no names, no histories, no uncomfortable questions about the past. There was something about her posture that caught Judah's attention. Not the desperate hunger of poverty, nor the practiced seduction of experience. Instead, she carried herself with a dignity that seemed at odds with her profession, as if she wore her role like an ill-fitting garment. The decision formed in Judah's mind with the same calculated clarity that had once led him to suggest selling Joseph. His mourning period was complete. His body carried needs that had been denied too long. This woman offered a solution that was both simple and anonymous. The negotiation was swift and practical. She named her price, a young goat from his flock, payment to be delivered later. When Judah explained he had no animal with him, she requested a pledge to hold until the debt could be settled. What she asked for should have given him pause. His seal, his cord, his staff. These were not mere accessories, but the ancient equivalent of identification documents. In Mesopotamian culture, a man's seal was his legal signature, his cord a mark of status, his staff a symbol of authority. To surrender all three was to place himself completely at her mercy. But desire had clouded Judah's usually sharp judgment. The same calculating mind that had orchestrated his brother's betrayal was suddenly operating at a deficit, overwhelmed by physical need and emotional exhaustion. He handed over the items without hesitation, driven by appetites that seemed to have accumulated power during the months of enforced celibacy. This was not love, not even affection. It was transaction, pure and simple. The kind of exchange that required no emotional investment from either party. The encounter itself was brief and businesslike, conducted in the shadows where daylight could not penetrate to reveal faces or judge motivations. When it was finished, the woman departed without ceremony, leaving Judah alone with the lingering scent of perfume and the hollow satisfaction of physical release. It was only later, as he walked back toward his own camp, that the first tendrils of unease began to creep into his consciousness. Something about the woman had felt familiar, though he could not place where he might have encountered her before. The next day, Judah sent Hira to deliver the promised goat and retrieve his pledge items. The friend returned empty-handed, his face wearing the expression of a man bearing unwelcome news. There was no prostitute at Enaim, Hira reported, his voice carefully neutral. The people of the area say no temple prostitute has been there. The words hit Judah like a physical blow. If the woman was not what she appeared to be, then who was she? And more importantly, why did she still possess the items that could identify him beyond any possibility of denial? Days passed without word or sign of the mysterious woman. Judah found himself scanning crowds for glimpses of her distinctive veil, listening to conversations for any mention of strange women appearing at roadsides. The anxiety that had begun as a minor irritation grew into something approaching panic. His seal, his cord, his staff, these were not items he could simply replace. They were unique markers of his identity, crafted specifically for him and recognized by everyone in his social circle. In the wrong hands, they could be used to authenticate documents, authorize transactions, or worse, provide evidence of activities he preferred to keep private. The irony was not lost on him. The man who had built his reputation on careful calculation had been outmaneuvered by a woman whose identity he did not even know. The brother seller had himself sold Bin, though he did not yet understand the currency of the transaction. 3 months later, the news reached him through the network of gossip and rumor that connected every household in their region. His daughter-in-law, Tamar, the widow he had sent away rather than risk to his remaining son, was pregnant. The accusation fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of scandal through the community. Tamar, who had been living as a widow in her father's house, supposedly chaste and waiting for Shayla to come of age, had played the harlot. She had violated the sacred trusts of widowhood and brought shame upon both her father's house and Judah's family name. The rage that filled Judah was immediate and overwhelming. This woman, who had already cost him 2 sons through whatever curse followed her, had now added adultery to her crimes. The audacity of it was breathtaking. To live under his protection while engaging in behavior that could destroy the family's reputation entirely. The penalty for such behavior was clear and ancient. Death by burning, the flame serving both as punishment and purification. Judah's anger was righteous and his authority absolute. As head of the family, he had not only the right but the obligation to demand justice. "Bring her out," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of patriarchal authority. "Let her be burned." The words felt good in his mouth, satisfying in their finality. This would end the curse that seemed to follow Tamar wherever she went. This would restore the moral order that had been so thoroughly disrupted by her presence in their lives. But even as he spoke the sentence, something cold settled in his stomach. Some instinct, honed by years of careful calculation and strategic thinking, whispered that this situation was not as simple as it appeared. The warning came too late. As Tamar was brought forward for execution, she produced 3 items from beneath her robes. Items that caught the morning light with the gleam of familiar metal and the weight of devastating recognition. A seal, a cord, a staff. Judah's seal, Judah's cord, Judah's staff. The silence that followed was absolute, pressing against the gathered crowd like the weight of divine judgment itself. In that moment, the careful edifice of righteousness that Judah had constructed around his anger crumbled like a wall built on shifting sand. The woman who had deceived him at a name was Tamar herself. The prostitute who had taken his pledge was his own daughter-in-law. The child she carried was his own offspring, conceived through a deception so complete that he had never suspected her true identity. The hypocrisy was stunning in its completeness. He who had condemned her for adultery had been the very man who enabled it. He who had demanded death by fire for her supposed harlotry had himself sought out what he believed to be a prostitute's services. He who had positioned himself as the moral authority of the family had been outwitted by the very woman he had wronged. "She is more righteous than I," he said, the words falling from his lips like stones dropped into deep water. because I did not give her to my son Sheila. The admission cost him everything: his authority, his reputation, his carefully maintained image as a man of honor. But it also freed him from the weight of a lie he could no longer sustain. Tamar had not acted out of lust or moral corruption. She had acted out of desperation, driven to deception by his own failure to fulfill the obligations that custom and justice demanded. Her masquerade as a prostitute was not evidence of her shame, but of his. The child she carried was not a product of adultery, but of a justice so poetic that it seemed divinely orchestrated. Through her deception, she had forced him to confront the consequences of his own moral failures in a way that no amount of guilt or regret could have accomplished. As the crowd dispersed and the immediate crisis passed, Judah found himself face to face with a truth more devastating than any external judgment. He had become exactly the kind of man he had once despised. The boy who had sold his brother for silver had grown into a patriarch who condemned others for the very sins he committed in secret. The transformation was complete, but it was not the one he had intended. In trying to escape his Hebrew guilt through Canaanite marriage and foreign customs, he had only succeeded in compounding his moral failures. The patterns of deception that had begun with Joseph's sale had infected every aspect of his life, turning him into a stranger to himself. But in the ashes of his exposed hypocrisy, something new was beginning to stir. For the first time since that distant day when silver had changed hands and chains had clinked in the desert sun, Judah was forced to confront the full weight of what he had become. The reckoning he had spent decades avoiding was finally at hand. In the aftermath of truth unveiled, silence settled over Judah's household like dust after a great storm. The crowd that had gathered to witness what they expected to be an execution had dispersed, carrying with them whispers that would echo through neighboring camps for generations. But for Judah himself, the real reckoning was only beginning. He stood alone in the courtyard where his authority had crumbled like clay in rain, staring at the ground where Tamar's life had almost ended by his own decree. The irony was so complete, so perfectly orchestrated, that it felt less like coincidence and more like cosmic justice finally catching up with a man who had spent decades outrunning his own shadow. The item she had returned to him lay heavy in his hands. His seal, warm from her touch and weighted with implications he was only beginning to understand. His cord no longer a symbol of authority but evidence of his fall from grace. His staff, which had once represented his power to judge others, now stood as testament to his own moral blindness. Each object told a story he did not want to remember but could no longer forget. The night at Enaim had not been a random encounter between strangers, but a carefully orchestrated confrontation between a man and his own failures. Tamar had not simply deceived him. She had held up a mirror that reflected the true shape of his soul. The recognition burned like acid in his chest. This was what he had become through years of careful calculation and strategic selfishness. A man so morally corrupt that his own daughter-in-law had been forced to play the harlot to obtain the justice he had denied her. A patriarch so blind to his own sins that he could condemn others for behavior he practiced in secret. The parallel to that long-ago day in the desert was inescapable. Then he had justified betraying Joseph by telling himself it was mercy disguised as profit. Now, he had nearly executed an innocent woman while ignoring his own guilt. The pattern was clear and damning. Judah had become a man who could see sin everywhere except in the mirror. But recognition, however painful, carries within it the seeds of transformation. For the first time since Joseph had disappeared into the slave markets of Egypt, Judah allowed himself to fully confront what he had done. Not just the mechanics of the betrayal, but its deeper meaning. He had not simply sold a brother. He had sold his own capacity for love. He had not merely traded flesh for silver. He had bartered away pieces of his soul until almost nothing recognizably human remained. The weight of this understanding was crushing. Every careful justification he had constructed over the years crumbled under the simple truth that Tamar's deception had revealed. He was not the victim of circumstances or family dysfunction, but the architect of his own moral destruction. Sleep became impossible in the nights that followed. Judah would lie awake staring at the ceiling of his tent, his mind cycling through memories that took on new and terrible meanings in the light of his recognition. Joseph's face as the chains were fitted around his wrists. Jacob's grief as he held the bloodied coat. Shua's disappointment as she watched her husband retreat into emotional numbness. And Onan's wickedness, learned at their father's knee and amplified by Canaanite corruption. Each memory was a stone added to the weight pressing down on his chest. The accumulated guilt of decades threatened to crush him entirely, leaving nothing but dust and regret where a man once stood. Yet in the depths of this despair, something unexpected began to stir. Call it grace, call it divine intervention, or simply call it the human soul's remarkable capacity for renewal even in the darkest circumstances. Whatever its source, a small flame of hope began to flicker in the darkness of Judah's conscience. The flame was fed by an unlikely fuel, the very completeness of his fall. He had descended so far from his original self that there was nowhere left to go but up. The man who had once calculated every move to maximize his advantage now found himself stripped of pretense, standing naked before the truth of what he had become. And in that nakedness, paradoxically, he discovered a kind of freedom. For the first time in decades, Judah stopped trying to justify his actions or manage their consequences. He simply accepted them. The brother he had sold, the father he had deceived, the daughter-in-law he had wronged, the sons who had died because of the poison he had allowed to infect his bloodline. All of it was his responsibility, his burden, his shame to carry. The acceptance was not resignation, but recognition. He could not undo what he had done, but he could choose what to do with the time remaining to him. He could continue the patterns of deception and calculation that had brought him to this point, or he could become something different. The choice crystallized in his mind with the same clarity that had once guided his most calculated decisions. But this time, the calculation was not about profit or advantage. It was about redemption. Tamar, heavy with his child, remained in his household, but their relationship had been transformed beyond recognition. Where once there had been patriarchal authority and submissive obligation, now there was something approaching mutual respect. She had outmaneuvered him completely, but she had done so not from malice, but from a desperate hunger for justice that he had failed to provide. In the weeks that followed, Judah found himself studying her with new eyes. This was not the cursed woman he had once believed her to be, but a person of remarkable strength and intelligence who had been trapped by circumstances beyond her control. Her deception at Enaim had not been the act of a harlot, but the desperate gambit of someone fighting for her very survival in a world that offered women few options. The child she carried represented more than just the fruit of their illicit encounter. It was a living symbol of justice achieved through unconventional means, of truth emerging from deception, of hope growing from the ashes of shame. In her womb, the corrupted bloodline that had produced Er and Onan was being given another chance at redemption. As her pregnancy advanced, Judah found himself experiencing emotions he had not felt in years. Not love exactly, but something approaching protective tenderness. This woman had risked everything to force him to confront his failures, and in doing so, she had offered him something he had not even known he needed: the possibility of becoming a different kind of man. The birth, when it came, was dramatic in ways that seemed to echo the complexity of its conception. Tamar labored through a day and a night, her strength tested to its limits by a delivery that defied normal patterns. When the first child's hand appeared, the midwife tied a scarlet thread around it to mark the firstborn, but then the hand withdrew and another child emerged first, breaking through ahead of his marked brother. The midwife's exclamation carried the weight of prophecy. What a breach you have made for yourself. She named the first child Perez, meaning breach or breakthrough. The second, bearing the scarlet thread, was called Zerah, meaning dawning or brightness. Judah held his sons with hands that trembled not from weakness, but from the magnitude of what they represented. These children, born from deception and scandal, carried within their veins the possibility of redemption. The bloodline that had seemed cursed through Er and Onan was being given another chance, another opportunity to manifest something worthy of its divine calling. The sky had forgotten how to weep. For 7 years the heavens remained sealed like bronze above the ancient world, refusing to release even a single drop of mercy upon the parched earth below. The Nile, that great lifeline of civilizations, continued to flow with its mysterious abundance. But beyond Egypt's borders, the world withered like flowers left too long in the sun. In Canaan, the land that had once flowed with milk and honey now cracked like broken pottery. Wells that had sustained generations ran dry, their depths revealing only dust and the bones of long-dead hopes. Flocks that had numbered in the thousands dwindled to scattered remnants, their bleating grown weak and desperate as they searched for grass that no longer existed. Jacob's household, once prosperous and secure, found itself facing the specter of starvation. The old patriarch, now bearing the name Israel but still carrying the wounds of Joseph's loss, watched his remaining sons with eyes that had learned to expect nothing but sorrow. The silver from Joseph's sale had long since been consumed by the ordinary expenses of survival, leaving no cushion against this extraordinary catastrophe. It was Judah who first spoke the words that everyone was thinking but none dared voice. They would have to go to Egypt. The decision hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Egypt meant grain, salvation, the possibility of survival. But it also meant confronting the unknown, placing themselves at the mercy of foreign powers, and for Judah, perhaps facing consequences he had spent decades trying to forget. The irony was not lost on him. The land where Joseph had disappeared into slavery was now their only hope for deliverance. The brother they had sold for profit might now hold the key to their survival, though they had no way of knowing whether he still lived or what had become of him in the intervening years. When the first delegation returned from Egypt with grain but troubling news, the family gathered in the largest tent to hear their report. The Egyptian who controlled the grain distribution had been harsh, suspicious, accusing them of being spies. More disturbing still, he had demanded that they return with their youngest brother Benjamin as proof of their honesty. Jacob's reaction was immediate and absolute. "You shall not take Benjamin," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had already lost too much. "His brother is dead, and he alone is left. If harm should come to him on the journey, you will bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to the grave." The words cut through Judah like a blade. Joseph's brother. The casual assumption that one son was dead while another lived, when the truth was far more complex and terrible than Jacob could imagine. The old man's protective love for Benjamin was the same fierce devotion he had once shown Joseph, and it stirred memories that Judah had tried to bury beneath years of self-justification. But as the grain they had purchased began to dwindle and hunger returned to stalk their tents like a patient predator, the luxury of protecting Benjamin from the harsh realities of survival became impossible to maintain. The choice was stark and unavoidable. Risk Benjamin on a journey to Egypt, or watch the entire family waste away in the slow agony of starvation. It was Judah who finally broke the deadlock, stepping forward with words that would have been unthinkable from the young man who had once calculated his brother's sale in terms of silver and profit. "Send the boy with me," he said, his voice steady but weighted with profound commitment. "I will be responsible for him. If I do not bring him back and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever." The transformation in those words was complete and stunning. The brother who had once sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver was now offering to stake his own honor, his own future, on the safe return of another brother. Where once there had been calculation, now there was sacrifice. Where once there had been cold pragmatism, now there was love willing to risk everything for the sake of family unity. Jacob studied his son's face with the penetrating gaze of a man who had learned to read the hearts of those around him through decades of disappointment and betrayal. What he saw there must have convinced him, for he finally nodded his reluctant consent. The second journey to Egypt was different from the first in ways that went beyond the presence of Benjamin. Judah found himself watching over his youngest brother with a protectiveness that surprised even him. Every mile of the journey, every potential danger along the road, every moment when Benjamin was out of his sight filled him with an anxiety that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with love. This was not the calculated concern of a man protecting valuable merchandise, but the fierce devotion of someone who had finally learned the true cost of losing a brother. The silver that had once seemed so important now felt like dust in his memory compared to the weight of responsibility he carried for Benjamin's safety. When they arrived in Egypt and were brought before the powerful official who controlled the grain distribution, Judah positioned himself protectively near Benjamin, ready to intervene if the man's suspicious nature turned toward violence. The Egyptians' eyes swept over their group with an intensity that seemed to see more than was visible on the surface, lingering longest on Benjamin with an expression that was impossible to read. The meal they were invited to share was elaborate beyond anything they had expected, served in a great hall with silver cups and delicacies that spoke of wealth beyond imagining. But Judah barely tasted the food, his attention focused entirely on watching for any sign that Benjamin might be in danger. The seating arrangement was curious. They were placed according to their ages with an accuracy that seemed impossible for a stranger to achieve. When Judah found himself positioned exactly where his birth order would dictate, a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature in the great hall. The Egyptian official's attention seemed drawn repeatedly to Benjamin, sending him portions from his own table that were 5 times larger than what the others received. The favoritism was obvious and troubling, reminiscent of the very dynamic that had once torn their family apart when Joseph had been the recipient of such preferential treatment. But this time Judah's response was different. Instead of resentment or calculation, he felt only concern for Benjamin's comfort and safety. The transformation in his character was so complete that he barely recognized himself in his new role as protector rather than exploiter. When morning came and they prepared to depart with their grain, the Egyptian steward stopped them at the city gates. A silver cup had been found in Benjamin's sack, the ruler's own divination cup, planted there like evidence of a crime that had never been committed. The accusation fell on the brothers like a physical blow. Benjamin, innocent and bewildered, stared at the cup as if it were a serpent that had somehow found its way into his possessions. The steward's words were clear and final. The one in whose sack the cup was found would remain as a slave while the others were free to return home. In that moment, Judah faced a choice that would define not just his character but the destiny of generations yet unborn. He could accept the steward's offer, return home with grain and gold, and explain to Jacob that Benjamin had been lost through no fault of their own. It was the practical solution, the calculated response that the old Judah would have chosen without hesitation. Instead, he stepped forward and spoke words that would echo through history as one of the most powerful pleas ever recorded. The speech that poured from Judah's lips was not prepared or calculated. It came from a heart that had been broken and reformed, from a soul that had learned the true cost of betrayal and chosen the path of redemption instead. He spoke of their father's love for Benjamin, of the old man's fragile heart that could not survive the loss of another son, of his own promise to bear responsibility for the boy's safety. But more than that, he offered himself as substitute. "Let your servant remain as a slave to my Lord instead of the boy," he pleaded, his voice breaking with the weight of genuine love. "Let the boy go back with his brothers." The transformation was complete. The man who had once sold a brother was now offering himself to save one. The calculating betrayer had become a sacrificial protector. The heart that had been hardened by rejection and poisoned by bitterness had learned to love with a purity that demanded everything and expected nothing in return. The silence that followed Judah's plea stretched across the great hall like a held breath. Egyptian servants stood frozen in their positions, their faces carefully neutral, as they witnessed a moment that would reshape the destiny of nations. The powerful official who controlled Egypt's grain sat motionless on his elevated seat, his own cup trembling slightly in hands that seemed to have forgotten how to remain steady. Then something extraordinary happened. The mask that had hidden the Egyptian's true identity for so long began to crack, not with anger or judgment, but with tears that spoke of wounds carried across decades and sorrows that had never fully healed. "Have everyone leave," the official commanded, his voice thick with emotions he could no longer contain. "Let no one remain here with me." The servants departed swiftly, leaving only the brothers in the presence of the man they had known only as Egypt's harsh but just administrator of grain. In the sudden privacy of the great hall, with only family present, though they did not yet understand they were family, the most shocking revelation in human history was about to unfold. "I am Joseph," he said, the words falling into the silence like stones dropped into deep water. "I am Joseph, your brother whom you sold into Egypt." The effect on the brothers was immediate and devastating. Some stepped backward as if struck by physical blows. Others fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the impossibility of what they were hearing. Judah felt the world tilt around him as if the very foundations of reality had shifted beneath his feet. The brother they had sold for 20 pieces of silver had become the second most powerful man in Egypt. The dreamer whose visions they had mocked now stood before them, clothed in authority that made their father's wealth seem like dust. The boy they had condemned to slavery had risen to heights none of them could have imagined in their wildest dreams. But it was not Joseph's power that struck Judah most forcefully. It was his tears. The man who could have commanded their execution with a word, who could have taken revenge that would have made their worst nightmares seem merciful, was weeping like a child, not with anger or triumph, but with a joy so profound that it seemed to shake the very pillars of the great hall. "Do not be afraid," Joseph said, his voice gentle despite the magnitude of the revelation. "And do not be angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." The words hit Judah like physical blows, each one carrying implications that his mind struggled to process. God had sent Joseph ahead? The betrayal that had haunted Judah's conscience for decades had somehow been part of a divine plan to save not just their family, but countless others who would have perished in the famine. Joseph continued speaking, his words weaving together threads of divine purpose and human redemption in ways that challenged everything Judah thought he understood about justice and mercy. The sale into slavery had led to service in Potiphar's house. False accusation and imprisonment had positioned Joseph to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. Divine revelation had elevated him to the position where he could store grain during the years of plenty and distribute it during the years of famine. Every step of the journey that had begun with chains and silver had been orchestrated by a wisdom too vast for human understanding to grasp fully. The brothers' betrayal had become the mechanism of deliverance. Their worst act had somehow been transformed into the instrument of salvation for multitudes. But Judah understood something that went deeper than divine providence or cosmic justice. He saw in Joseph's tears and forgiveness a mirror of the transformation that had been taking place in his own heart. The brother who had every right to demand vengeance was choosing mercy instead. The victim of betrayal was becoming the agent of reconciliation. The reunion that followed was emotional beyond description. Benjamin, discovering that his mysterious benefactor was actually the brother he barely remembered, collapsed into Joseph's arms with sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. The other brothers, still stunned by the magnitude of what they were learning, approached tentatively, unsure whether they were walking toward forgiveness or judgment. Joseph embraced each one individually, his tears flowing freely as he spoke their names and recalled memories from their shared childhood that the years had not diminished. When he reached Judah, their eyes met in a moment of understanding that required no words. The brother seller and the brother sold faced each other across a chasm bridged by mercy that neither had earned, but both desperately needed. "You meant it for evil," Joseph said, his words carrying the weight of truth that could heal even the deepest wounds. "But God meant it for good to bring about what is now taking place, the saving of many lives." The implications of those words would echo through the generations. Evil transformed into good, betrayal becoming salvation, human wickedness serving divine purposes through the mysterious alchemy of providence and grace. As the initial shock began to subside, practical arrangements had to be made. Joseph sent his brothers back to Canaan with wagons and provisions, instructing them to bring their father and all their households to Egypt, where they could survive the remaining years of famine in safety and abundance. The journey home passed in a blur of wonder and disbelief. Judah found himself studying his brothers' faces as they processed what they had learned, watching them wrestle with the same questions that churned in his own mind. How could such good come from such evil? How could their worst act become the instrument of their salvation? Sermon. When they reached their father's camp and delivered the news that Joseph was alive and ruling in Egypt, Jacob's reaction was everything they might have expected and more. The old man's legs gave way beneath him as the words penetrated his understanding. Joseph alive, not just alive but powerful beyond imagining. The bloodied coat they had presented decades earlier had told a lie so convincing that Jacob had built his grief around it like a monument. Now that lie was being exposed, not through confession but through revelation that made confession unnecessary. The truth was too wonderful to require apologies. As preparations began for the great migration to Egypt, Judah found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The silver that had once seemed so important had long since been spent and forgotten. The calculations that had once driven his every decision now seemed as meaningless as counting grains of sand. What remained was the knowledge that even the darkest chapters of human experience could be transformed by forces too mysterious to understand but too powerful to deny. The brother he had sold had become their savior. The betrayal he had orchestrated had become the mechanism of their deliverance. The man who had learned to calculate everything had discovered that the most important truths lay beyond the reach of human mathematics. Love and mercy, forgiveness and redemption. These operated by laws that transformed rather than merely tallied, that created rather than simply measured. In the end, every story of transformation echoes the same eternal truth. No fall is too far, no betrayal too complete, no heart too hardened for redemption to reach. Judah's name, which began as praise, became synonymous with an entire people who would carry both the burden and the blessing of divine calling through centuries of triumph and exile, persecution and restoration. The silver has long since turned to dust, but the story it purchased continues to speak across millennia, reminding us that our worst moments need not define us and that even in our darkest choices, forces greater than ourselves are weaving threads of purpose we cannot yet see.